Normally in our geoeconomics conference, we don't talk about geostrategy, about geopolitics. We leave it for the other conferences which are normally held in Delhi. In Mumbai and Pune, it is more business, more economics. But we are in the city where Dr. Raja Mohan, one of India's leading geostrategic experts, geopolitical experts, lives, and therefore we thought that we must have him as a guest. And thank you so much for having accepted our invitation. So let's dive straight in and talk. After having heard a lot about economics, about supply chains, about how weather trade in the Trump era, let's dive straight into. I think I should ask you point blank, what is President Trump all about? What is he trying to do? Why is he messed up the whole world? Why is he being such a big disruptor, as we heard this word? And why has he brought in so much uncertainty? What is he gaining, or his country gaining out of it? If I could ask you in a very bland and bold fashion.
I think to understand what Trump is doing, it's important to look at his political support base. So I don't think he's a cranky, personal, whimsical policy, actually. What I see, at least looking at the US domestic politics, the so-called Make America Great Again movement, which actually helped him survive all kinds of onslaughts on him when he was out of power, to come back. I think that movement has actually questioned three core assumptions of post-war America. The three assumptions are that economic globalization is good for the United States. Two, that international leadership, multilateral institutions, alliances, these are critical for American success. And third, open borders is a good thing. So what you have is actually all three elements of it: globalization, internationalism, and open borders. All three are under attack. And the consequence of that, we see a clear attempt at, reducing, shall we say, the economic exposure to the world. Linked to it, the whole question of bringing manufacturing back into America. You can argue, as the Secretary of Commerce had said, look, maybe it'll hurt America, but that's not the point. Politicians, they're not waiting to see it's good for them. It is the politics of it. Which is what we got to understand. And I think this has been building up for quite some time. The Brexit was similar. In Europe today too, there are growing similar sentiments. So therefore, you can say, look, this was really a problem of inequity in the US, not of trade policies. But I think today, a large number of Americans, especially the white working class, sees that they were they were the losers of globalization. And that the outsourcing of manufacturing has actually cost jobs. So that's the first point. Second, I think the idea that, look, US should have global leadership. These people are saying, why? Why should we? Does global leadership mean I send my boys to Iraq and Afghanistan? Why should Americans pay the price for global leadership? What have we got for it? You could argue America has gained a lot from global leadership in terms of it defines the economic policies, the international architecture. But they say, look, the benefits for the ordinary Americans have not been much. And the third is the immigration. That you got too many people have come in, and it's not just in the US, across the board in the Anglo-Saxon world, and more increasingly in Europe. People feel that whatever the economic logic might be, that too many outsiders create social backlash. The question of culture, nationality, national culture, all those issues have come. After all, Indians should not be surprised because you're so worried about foreigners, right? So I think the scale of immigration, at least the argument of the MAGA, is that, look, Biden has allowed almost 2 million people to come in 4 years. So I think that is so in the end, the core argument is, you take away my jobs, you bring in outsiders and send me to fight global wars. So I think that is, to summarize it, that is the resistance, and I think he's really responding to those demands. But what we don't know, can he sustain these three policies? Would they kind of produce a backlash of their own? But at this point, I think Trump seems to be having a hegemony over American domestic politics. And the US, US is designed to actually to have too many competing voices. Two houses of Congress, you have two parties, you have federalism, genuine federalism, unlike our federalism. But all that is suppressed today at this point of dominance. Whether this will last or not, we don't know. But I think we got to appreciate the sources of policy, and I think we have no choice but to deal with them as they come.
So, you have been always very vocal about non-alignment. I read your book on crossing the Rubicon. So, building on that, US and China, there is some amount of decoupling happening, and there is weaponization of global supply chains. So, in this context, for emerging economies like India, is there any space for strategic autonomy left, or do we have to choose sides this time?
You don't make me unpopular by saying, look, I think we should not confuse the economic strategy issues with things like non-alignment or strategic autonomy. Because look, we were supposed to be non-aligned, but we signed a security treaty with the Russians. Even now, we can't say a word against the Russians. Russians can do what they want. So this notion that somehow we were non-aligned, that's not accurate. That 1962, Nehru went to the Americans. 1971, you went to the Russians. So therefore, to say somehow we had this grand policy of non-alignment, I don't think that's accurate. It doesn't reflect the realities on the ground. Similarly, on strategic autonomy, again, a category that kind of we all love it. So now India is in a position like somewhat as Germany is. Say Germany outsources security to the Americans, energy to the Russians, and markets to the Chinese. I think we've done something similar. We're dependent on Russia for arms. 60% of your weapons are still Russian. We import most of our inputs from manufacturing inputs from China. And if you open up, all your digital stuff is linked to the Americans. So to say then, look, that somehow we are pursuing strategic autonomy is a slogan. It doesn't tell you, it doesn't explain anything to you. So the strategic question is, look, how do we grow? See, start from your interest. Look, how do I get to 8% growth rate? Where is the capital going to come? Where is the technology going to come? Which are the markets I can export to? That is the real questions. But we subsume that Delhi is a disease in Delhi. Hopefully it doesn't afflict Pune and Bombay. That this constant references to strategic autonomy by the Indian foreign policy community, it's really not helpful. So the question is today, where are your markets for exports? They're with the US and Europe. Right, Russia imports $5 billion from you and a deficit of $50 billion. China imports $15 billion of goods from you, a deficit of $100 billion. Now, you can say what you want, I'm multi-aligned, I'm equal to everyone. That doesn't take care of your economic problem. Your markets are in US and Europe. So I think that's where focus on the specific issue and strategy, rather than conflating with these general slogans that are popular in Delhi. They're really not helpful to actually either historically or today in terms of what we ought to do.
So if I may follow that up, so India and EU are in the process of signing an FTA, and almost 60% of that, they have sort of negotiated over 60% of the chapters. How does India's negotiating capacity get affected with the US tariffs on India when it comes to EU, especially when it comes to dairy and such sensitive sectors which are always crucial or very critical in any FTA? So
look, I'm not a trade guy, so don't pull me into that.
Okay.
But what is it? Look, I think the US tariffs has pressed you into accelerate the talks with Europe. That is at least one big market you try and secure. So in a way, the American pressure is compelling you, one, to reform internally, which is the main message we heard from the last session was reform internally. And similarly on the outside, you look for new markets, given the uncertainty with the US, which is what you're trying to do with Europe. And actually over the last 5 years, you can say India, actually, the RCEP happened, withdrawal from RCEP happened, good or bad, 2019, even before Galwa. Since then, you actually moved closer to the West, focusing on free trade agreements with the West, because there is a more complementarity compared to Asia, which actually is similar economies, or China, which actually dominates manufacturing. So if you look at last 5 years, we've done something with UAE, we've done something with UK, with Australia, now with Europe, and the US. I think as the Secretary said earlier, our trade policy is still looking for shallow agreements. And you're not ready for deep integration. I think that is the source of the problem, that India unwilling to make its markets competitive and open up, because I don't know how many of you read Robert Lighthizer book. He was Trump's US trade representative in the first administration. He has a book called No Trade is Fair, No Trade is Free. Basically says, and there's a 2-3 pages on India, where he says, look, in dealing with India, we always had a problem with our trade policy. I kept files on top 10 oligarchs of Indian business. So if I understood the interests of the 10 oligarchs, I know what the Commerce Ministry's trade policy is. So I think that's one set of problems, and I think that's where the issue is, that unless you really break monopolies, unless you begin to make your industry more competitive, whichever trade you negotiate. So there's a saying in Punjab, I'm not a Punjabi, but if you're a fool in Lahore, you're not going to be a genius in Peshawar, right? So if you're not a free trader in Asia, you're not going to be a free trader in the West. So I think that's where the problem is internal. If you don't fix that internal problem, it doesn't matter how many trade agreements you negotiate. So,
something you said earlier. Sorry. Something you said earlier. I must say the microphones are better in Pune than in Delhi. But something you said earlier also was it was music to my ears, because when I retired from the government, I took this decision that I'm not going to stay in Delhi anymore. And you are saying that that's the right decision, locating myself in Pune. So thank you for saying that. But could I turn the conversation a little bit towards the other major power, which is, of course, China. And as you have already referred to, there are huge problems that India faces, political, military with China. There are economic issues also, the huge trade deficit that we have with China. And the fact that, I think our values, their values, and interests are also quite diametrically opposite. So as we go forward, how do you think we should manage the China relationship? Because I believe, and I may be wrong and you may disagree with me, that at best we can only manage it. But how should we deal with China as we go ahead, and especially as there seems to be a little bit of unfreezing of the relationship over the last year or so?
I think since Gautam is the China expert, so I want to talk about China to him. And actually, the Pune International Centre, I think, produced a report, was it 3 years ago? Of how do you deal with the massive asymmetry that we have with China today, on the economic side. $100 billion every year. I mean, it's like over a decade you're giving them $1 trillion gift to the Chinese. That the scale of India's dependence on China's manufacturing, that how you correct that. I think it's again an internal problem. I would say the attempt to do PLI or to make manufacturing easier, they just produce some results, but nowhere near the scale that you want. So how long that will take, that is a real question, and I think this is a long process. Second, I think this thing about the Tianjin moment, that suddenly it's all love and thing between Indians and the Chinese. There was a strategic move there in terms of shaking hands with Xi and Putin, but the next day, if you saw this plenary of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, India was opposing Belt and Road Initiative. India is not going to, raising questions about China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. So I think it points to the deep structural contradictions between India and China. On economic side, as you said, $100 billion trade dollar deficit. On the border, we don't agree on the length of the border. We say it's 4,000, they say it's 2,000. We don't agree on where the border actually lies. We now increasingly in the last 10 years, the military balance on the border is in favor of China. Chinese are best friends of Pakistan, and increasingly to all our neighbors. Most of the SAARC members have showed up at SCO. So I think the fundamental problem is the power imbalance, both economic, military, that has emerged, because 30 years of reform in China has produced the second largest economy, the second most important military power, and increasingly a leading technological power. I think that is the China of today, and dealing with it, I think, will require, the answer again is internal. If you don't change yourself internally, your ability to close the gap anytime would only get worse. And the problem is, you can't fix this problem through diplomacy. That's what you guys tried for the last 75 years. But I think the problem has become worse because of the power imbalance. In the end, I would say, look, as a big neighbor of ours, we have to have peaceful coexistence with China. You keep trying to achieve that. But at the same time, you also have to balance, because what is power differential does to your economy, to your neighborhood, is a problem. Therefore, getting both these things done simultaneously without precipitating a war with China, but that's a challenge I think Gautam and his colleagues have confronted over the last 20 years, and I don't think we have answers yet. So to the extent that we resume the dialogue on restoring peace and tranquility on the border, that we resume negotiations on the boundary dispute itself, these are two separate things, and then start exploring economic CBMs. All these are good measures, but I think the scale of the challenge we should not forget between us. And somebody says, flights are starting. I mean, if you see how many flights there are between Japan and China, Australia and China, I mean, the scale of economic interaction. But I think we are in a very, very difficult place. And I think we have really need to put our head down and really get going domestically. That's the only way I think we're going to deal with the Chinese power.
So I keep bringing you back to the European Union because you recently wrote in India's World, and that article is fresh in my mind. So India's negotiations with the European Union recently, and European Union's overtures towards India to deepen the strategic ties. In that context, how does is India able to balance the American protectionism with that relationship? And how does the Russian dimension play? How does the Russian power in the region balance that situation?
Look, I think on the trade issue, look, EU is also looking at alternative partners. I mean, some in Europe are calling it the century of humiliation. I mean, three major things. I mean, you had the pressure on NATO 5% defense expenditure. Though Europeans pretend to, they've agreed with it. I mean, that would demand dramatic escalation of taxes. They're not going to do it. But they had to agree to Daddy Trump. Second, the so-called Tierney Accord, where they simply surrendered on the trade negotiations. And the third, on the tech companies, there again, I think the Europeans have had no choice. So I think Europe wants to reduce its strategic dependence on US, and it's looking to partners. It's not just India. Japan is a major partner for them. They've signed free trade agreements with Singapore. Yesterday, von der Leyen talked about doing more things with a whole range. Canada, they've done something with Canada. So they're looking for partners. The question is, can we move fast enough? Because don't forget, in 2014, EU suspended talks with India, saying this is going nowhere. Because India was so difficult to negotiate with. But today, I think from the Indian side, we're signaling political will. You resume the talks. Last 2 days, they said, look, we're going to do it by the end of the year. Even if we do it by the spring, it'll be great. But I'm not so sure, given the pace of our negotiation, I always wonder.
So I'll just follow that up, because we had a session on this in one of our past Asia Economic Dialogues about EU suspending talks with India. And there was a lot of criticism from India saying that EU includes certain countervailing measures into the agreement, which sort of is not very helpful for emerging economies. They include clauses related to the environment, which is simply not possible for a country like India to maintain at the current situation. So do you see those things not happening this time?
But you're negotiating, right? I mean, if you say, look, a priori you say, look, your conditions are not acceptable, therefore I'm going home, you take your bat and ball and say, this game is unfair. But the fact that you're negotiating, and you come, 70% of the way, so they will have to be, see, look, this is not the first time negotiators do tricks to get over these kind of things. I mean, if you ask your industry, I know there are more experts in the room, are we going to forever say we can't match up? Some sectors of the industry are saying, look, we want to modernize, we want to reduce our carbon emissions, both your steel industry, aluminum industry. But if the Commerce Ministry bureaucrats say, look, we are going to make no internal changes, you take it or leave it. I think our policy has seemed to have changed. Similarly on human rights. If they could do a deal with the Chinese, with the Chinese human rights. What is your problem? So I think there are ways in which you fix these problems, but nothing is insurmountable if you have the political will. And the trick is to find, because Europe today, I believe, earlier they used to say, we want a comprehensive agreement. India, of course, says we jump across the chasm in 2 leaps. Let's do it first tranche. Let's then we'll do a second tranche. We'll do a third tranche. They seem to have agreed to reduce some of their demands. So we are eager to do it because we have problems. So I would expect progress, but I think the important thing is not to start with the assumption. If you're as a scholar, if you want to say, like, what is the trick here? How do you fix this problem? What is the way of going forward? That would be good trade research, trade policy research. On Russia question.
Yes.
Look, I think, what I say is very unpopular, so I want me to say it. Look, the idea that we don't criticize Russia because they're supposed to be best friends forever. Now, this is not new today. 1956 in Hungary, you didn't criticize them. 1968 Czechoslovakia, you didn't criticize them. 1979 when they came into Afghanistan, you didn't criticize them. When they took over Crimea in 2014, you didn't criticize them. And when they came into eastern Ukraine in 2022 February, also you don't criticize. Now, we have a mental problem of taking a position because you fear somehow you lose your sheet anchor for foreign policy. And the claim, and a lot of Gautam's colleagues say, oh, they saved us in UN. Now, tell me, in 1950, we were the 6th largest economy. But this idea, one resolution in the UN Security Council, even assuming by the Anglo-Americans, assuming the resolution was passed, nobody vetoed it. What would have happened? I think they would have taken away Kashmir. We're already one of the biggest armies in the world. But I think it is this mental difference, the fear without Russia, without the Russian crutch, you won't be able to do anything. And I think we are willing to pay a price for that. That's what is happening. That look, if you don't deal with the fact Europe is in war with Russia. The war is in the 4th year. The idea you can simply go there and buy oil from one side and say, oh, we were only doing it for our own reasons. Now, how do you convince in a war? So I think that's part of the problem. Like Turkey, they criticize the Russian invasion and they do business with Russia. But we couldn't even get ourselves to say what Russia did was wrong from our own principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity. You think the example of Crimea, you would accept it in Kashmir? Somebody would occupy it and say, I've done a referendum, organized a referendum, 99% vote supports separation from India. But I think we just can't do it. I think that's a political problem. But I think the costs of that policy are being tested. How much are you going to stand up and say, look, is my right to buy oil from Russia? At least formally, the government policy itself is saying, oh, this is not government policy. This is the entities will do there on the purely commercial basis. So they have some room to play this game. So my sense is, just as with Iran, just as with other countries, when it comes to crunch, your own economy and security, you'll be more careful and balanced. So I think the key is not to say you snap your relationship with Russia. The question is, what is the overall scheme of things in which your economy, your interests are weighed with care?
So let me then ask you this question that, this great turbulence that we have been witnessing in politics, in economics, in technology, all across the world over the last few years, not so much during COVID because that was something which happened, but definitely from then and since then. Is this because of the fact that one major power is waning and another major power is rising, and there is a huge amount of competition which is taking place between the two major powers? It's a competition for dominance, a competition for great power, whatever you want to call it, rivalry. Is that the reason why this huge, upsurge is taking place all over the world?
Look, I think clearly one superpower is rising. I think China is rising from where it was 30 years ago, today where it is. I think we got, whether we like them or not, we got to accept that extraordinary miracle. And it's not a miracle, actually. Miracle means God did it, but they did it themselves. Deng Xiaoping did it, shall we say. that is a reality today. But that doesn't mean the US has actually declined, waning. If you see, the US share of total GDP of the world has remained largely around 25%. That has not changed. Actually, China's rise has been at the expense of Japan and Europe in terms of relative shares. So the US is still there. And I think that's why the idea that the US would cede power to the Chinese in Asia is the question. Chinese want to hegemony in Asia, accepted by the West, the US. Will the US go gently into the night, saying, decline elegantly and hand over to the Chinese? They won't. What Trump's policy has created a confusion, where he says, look, I'll do a deal with China, or I'll also do a deal with Russia. See, now that has raised doubts across the board. Now, is he really, until last year, we thought US is going to balance China. Today, Trump, where is he? That's a problem. Second problem, you saw the new national defense strategy that's being drafted. It's not been released yet, where they say, look, homeland defense is more important than American forward military presence. Say, I need more soldiers in Chicago than in Taiwan. I need my troops will go to the borders. Actually, America is using today, Trump is using American military to defend its borders. So it's a new situation. Now, where this will come out at the end of it, we are only in the first 9 months. My own sense is, how much Trump might do, the contradiction between US and China can't be squared so easily. Therefore, that battle, I think, will continue in a kind of seesaw manner, in a not a linear fashion, but it will go up and down. But I think the structural contradiction cannot be solved. At this point, the US is saying, I don't need allies. I can do a direct deal with Beijing. I'm not sure it is sustainable. But for the America's allies and partners, then the question in the near term becomes, what do we do? There, I think the question of self-reliance, doing more by yourselves, building your own capabilities, all become important given the uncertainty that's been induced by Trump. But I think this churn is going to be here because it's not just economic and technological in particular, where the Chinese competition has dramatically increased and how the US will deal with it. Because still under the Biden administration, the Americans are saying nearshoring, friendshoring, now he's saying reshoring. He's saying trusted supply chains, let's work in partnerships. Trump says, I'll do everything myself, even iPhones can't be made in India. So is this going to be the policy for the next 4 years? Will it change? I think that's where, in the end, a major incident, as Gautam has seen many critical incidents between US and China, which have transformed the debate within the US. So I think we have to wait and see. But I see you can't really solve the problem of a power being challenged by emerging, a rising power.
I think I must ask you this question because I'm sure many of our guests, audience members will also be thinking about it. The turbulence in our own neighborhood, you know, they're falling like dominoes. I mean, Sri Lanka first, Bangladesh, Nepal. So what the hell is happening?
Look, I think it's one of the great tragedies or contradictions. But if you go back to 1947-49, India was divided and China was united. China was a fragmented, through a civil war. While they were fighting Japanese occupation, they were also internally divided. Big fight between the nationalists and the communists at home. And for almost 40 years of civil war within China, ended with Chinese Communist Party taking charge and uniting Chinese territory to one of its biggest extents in history in 1949. And it was a strong government. I mean, initially quite shaky, but they consolidated. They hold on Tibet, Xinjiang, Yunnan, all across. So you had actually a powerful state that's emerged in China. But the fragmentation of India has meant what was the superpower in the East, the British Raj. You divided it. You turned it now. The energies today go of the inward conflicts have become more. That is, new borders had to be defended between India and Pakistan, India and East Pakistan. Then you had China as a neighbor in Tibet. So what you had was actually an India that was outwardly oriented till 47, now becomes inwardly oriented with the internal disputes. Then on top of it, the unresolved conflicts of partition, whether it's Kashmir, the division of the rivers, the two great rivers of the subcontinent, the Ganges and the Indus. I mean, these are, for any context, these would have been humongous problems. But I think the political division and the continuing hostility has meant these problems have become harder. And I think to complicate it further, the rise of China has actually given China an easy way of keeping you off balance by supporting your neighbors. It's a classic, Kautilya would have said, look, that's the right way to go if you're sitting in Beijing. So our answer to that is, how do we integrate the subcontinent? How do I reduce my disputes with Pakistan and Bangladesh? But unfortunately, we tried, I think, with some success with Bangladesh. For 10 years, things seem to be going the right way. That's fallen apart. Therefore, if you don't sort out your problems with your neighbors, it's a free hand for the Chinese to be able to dominate. And the fact that they're the second largest economy, the amount of money China can bring in to all our neighboring countries, and it doesn't take much. Because if China is a $20 trillion economy, every one of them has signed up to Belt and Road Initiative. Except Bangladesh and Bhutan, everybody was in Tianjin. They're all going to be members of SCO. SARC is not working. So I think we have to really get down to basic questions. Look, where do we go from here? How do we deal with our neighborhood? The problems that were staring us in our face since 47, they have not disappeared. Actually, some of them have become worse. So this, I would say, is, but I think we've learned something from the 10 years of good things that happened with Bangladesh. But I think we need to replicate that. Even with Pakistan, it's an unpopular thing to say. You want to say we should talk to Pakistan? You can't even shake hands on a cricket field. You can't, so you actually, we are trapping ourselves into a downward spiral. To get out of this, I think will require a lot of political courage, I think. So that's where the challenge is.
So building up on that, with the recent protests in Nepal, which saw a new leadership take the place of the old leadership, do you think that India needs to recalibrate its diplomatic relations with Nepal so that any perception of dominance or interference is avoided in this turmoil?
Look, I think we think we're nice guys, but you ask our neighbors, that's not the general impression. So, it's like a mirror, a neighborhood always holds up a mirror to you. And we always resented against Americans have said they've done this. I mean, the same problem in a neighborhood. Look, so I think we have to recognize that, look, they have the lives of their own. It's not my responsibility to fix Nepal's domestic problems. Nepal will have its problems. There is politics in Nepal. There will be politics in Sri Lanka. Today, we thought Maldives was getting somewhere. Now you saw what happened in the last week. So even the smallest country of less than 1 million people, there will be political battles. I think for us, historically, we've taken the position, we were the inheritors of the British Raj. Therefore, we are responsible, my bab, for the whole region. But the problem is, you're not able to exercise that power because you don't have the leverage. You're not the British Raj. So therefore, I think we got to let some things develop on their own. That's one part. Second, it's not about us. I mean, you see our TV channels, they're getting beaten up in Nepal. I mean, it's as if, it's all about you in what's happening in country. Oh, he's anti-India, he's pro-India. Come on, I mean, they have lives of their own. They're not doing it because they like you or dislike you. They have internal battles. So there, I think we become too self-referential, too self-centered to see everything pro-India, anti-India, pro-India, anti-India. But look, life is more than that. And I think that's where the problem is, less with the government. The government has not said a statement on, say, in Maldives when we had a difficult time. But your social media, your media goes crazy, and which makes you look pretty silly in the rest of the world. I think this way, hyper-nationalism, thing in the media actually creates problems for the government to be able to actually negotiate. For example, on the cricket issue. Would you have given a walkover and walked out of the tournament? Could you have done that? So you had no choice but to play. But if you didn't play, you hand over the game. But then you get into all kinds of twists of dealing with that issue. So I think we got to relax a bit, let the regional contradictions unfold, and see where more economic assistance, where we can give, more regional integration, where we can trade. Look, I think all our neighbors feel India is a very difficult market to access. Whether it's Bhutan or the United States, everyone thinks we are a protectionist. No, that's a reality. So therefore, I think we need to change a lot of policies. Again, I think it's all to do with what we do internally and not what we do externally.
So if you had been the captain of the Indian cricket team, you would have shaken hands.
Say that, yeah, I would have.
I mean, I'm asking.
Look, I think, you made it only, you're making it worse for yourself.
Yeah.
Next time what you do, tomorrow there's going to be another match.
Okay. Sorry to put you on the spot. Let me say it. If I had been the cricket captain, I would have shaken hands. For whatever it's worth. But
You are the ambassador to Pakistan, Commissioner.
so now I better take the next flight and go back to Pune. I think living in Delhi will become impossible for me. But let me just end with just one. So from the major takeaway that I have is we go back to the book that Ajit Ranade, myself and a few others from Pune had written together 3 or 4 years ago, which you referred to, which is that a lot of the solution to many of the geopolitical, geostrategic issues is basically growth, faster growth, and even faster growth. And we should be aspiring, instead of growing at 6.5% per annum, we should be aspiring to grow at 8, 9, 10%, maybe even 11 and 12% per annum. And eventually in a 15, 20-year time span, time horizon, that will then give us some leverage with other countries. Is that a right conclusion?
No, I think, as we say, look, 2 things. I mean, reform, 8% growth rate. I mean, that's the only answers for all your problems. Actually, if you don't do that, rest of it, as we said, you can't be fixed by diplomacy. You can't be fixed by clever leadership. That is, if you don't, see, look, we're still, for all the talk about, we say, 4th largest economy. Your per capita income is still $2,800. Huh? Yeah, at this, in the rank. So I would say, look, I mean, that is your. So when the PM says we must be a Viksit Bharat, and you talk about a per capita income of $10,000, right? Is a goal. I don't know if it can be done. Ranade can tell us. But the fact is, it's an aspiration. I think good aspiration. I think all the steps you take towards that goal, that how do I improve prosperity of Indian people? But then if you put that as a goal, a whole lot of other things will fall in place. And I think that's where the challenge is. And if you say increase, I mean, forget, even if you get from 2,800 to 5,000, India will be a different place. What then, today, for example, Pakistan, for all the talk, is stuck at $400 billion for the last 5-6 years. Per capita income, less than 2,000. So it's not as if others are doing, so you stick to your thing, you grow faster, focus on your economic growth and prosperity. The rest then will automatically follow, because if you're, what are the Chinese saying? Rich country, strong army. If you're a richer country, you can spend more on defense. If you're a rich country, you can spend more on, your archaeology, you can spend more on education, R&D. So I think these two, this is what I think Deng Xiaoping was a genius when he said, to get rich is glorious. I think that's what we should be. Let's all get rich, as a country as a whole. I mean, not just a few individuals as it's happening right now.
Dr. Raja Mohan, thank you so much for being with us, and that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much. Please join me in applauding Dr. Raja Mohan.